So even when the family is all together, guess what? They're often looking at screens, and they don't have a chance to talk to each other. But the idea is to pass biblical principles down to our children. So would that require time?
Yeah, what?
But how much time is spent on that?
And getting back to the screens there, the screens really don't give any instruction for biblical principles. There's no human interaction out of those screens.
In fact, it may be, as part of the current and popular culture, promote marital indifference, if not excuse unfaithfulness.
I don't think that's generally a concern at a young age, but
That's what he's saying, yeah.
I do know that now there's some group of pediatricians that are saying under 1 year of age, kids should not even see a screen.
Under 2 years. 2 years.
For 2 years, some young age, yeah, because it inhibits the development, mental development.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And the eye-hand coordination.
No, it's the images change so quickly
Rapid.
that
It mesmerizes,
it
messes with the brain.
it makes the brain go like they're having a seizure because their eyes are trying to,
And their brain hasn't
follow.
developed enough, yeah.
yeah.
The other thing I heard, which was interesting, was if parents are on their cell phones or whatever all the time when they're around their kids won't respect them as much.
I could believe that.
Christine has some input here for
Well,
us.
when you mentioned at the very beginning that the mother and the father are working so hard that they don't have time, and we could go back to the standard of, you know, what's your priority when you become a parent? It's to raise your children yourself. And I know it's really difficult in this day and age, but you have to make this conscious decision, I feel, to forego some of the amenities that two incomes would give, and just have one parent being at home being the parent. I mean, this is really difficult in our culture because we have so much material need, if you want to say need in quotes, but really, that's really what it comes down to.
Well, to be fair, a lot of people can't afford to have one person in the home because
Well-
our society has developed into a society that is basically requires two incomes.
That's what I'm saying. If you get your priorities straight on what you really need.
I don't, yeah.
But just
People-
basic housing
Yes.
sometimes
Food,
requires.
Two, if not more.
Ken's got one finger, now he's got two fingers up.
Uh-oh.
All right.
If you only knew what that meant at my work to have one or two or three fingers up, you wouldn't say that. Anyways,
How naive I am.
You're not a teacher.
I'm not a teacher.
I guess my comment along those lines would be that so we do as parents need to be focused on what are the important things. So is it important enough for my kid to get a Christian education that both my wife and I should work? Or is it better for my wife not to work and for my kid not to go to a Christian school?
Probably $4,000 or $5,000 a year per kid.
I think,
Some families are not a single child family.
Yeah,
I think that brings up a good point that homeschooling is really expensive. People look at it like, oh, well, I can't afford to pay for this school, but like in Ken's case, his wife is a nurse. And she's doing homeschooling, that's costing a lot more money in potential earnings than it would for her to be working full-time.
But she's committed to her kids and her family.
I
Pastor,
just thought of this. It's a new thought. When he was talking, it hadn't occurred to me to think about that as a church family. You know, what we believe in is church school and not parent school. So the church as a whole And we do that through subsidies that the church gives to the school. But we should look at that too. Look at the families in our church and think about, even though they may not be in poverty and on food stamps, maybe they're in a situation where they genuinely cannot afford Christian education, and we should look for a way to make that possible.
One thing I would build on that is, even if the parents have made bad decisions, we still have a responsibility to those kids. So I think it's easy to judge a circumstance, but praise God, he didn't judge us by our circumstance.
Well, in some ways, maybe we owe those children even more so that they don't get kind of penalized twice.
You know, I'll share a thought too. I don't remember the source of this, but it was talking about if you hate your work versus if you love your work, if your work really feeds you, and how long your work day is. They said it's better for a parent that feels fed and feels like their work has meaning and value to work a longer day and come home not burned out and resentful than for somebody to work an 8-hour day and hate their job and come home. They said it'd be better for them to be away from the family than bring that attitude home. Which leads me to, we always seem to want to separate and compartmentalize these different parts of life, but if we're in God, if he's a part of whatever we do, we're always a witness for him. My grandfather, my mom's dad, has taught me more about God through his just being, just what he does, than any other source, I think. And part of it was his spirit towards what he's done. He can't hold still. He's always been working, and almost always, as I grow up thinking about it, was always helping somebody else. He was doing things for others. And so, to me, that's a mighty witness of who God is and what he's like.
And I have some couple commentaries here I'd like to share with you. Do you think that God is a risk taker?
We've taken a chance on all of us by creating us with freedom to choose.
Okay. This idea that we call free moral agency has a lot of potential of loving him or wanting nothing to do with him. I remember when my youngest daughter said, "Dad, I'll always be a Christian." But I don't know about being a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't have that one figured out. Well, I tried not to be horrified. I tried not to react. I just tried to say that that's the most expensive investment God has ever made in his experience, was to grant you and I free moral agency and sacrifice his son to prove it. I don't know that the weight of that statement registered with her, but I think it has now that she's older and when she feeds back information now about her experience. But I think CJ can add something to this discussion.
I might take us on a big time tangent, but last week at work we had somebody come and give a really powerful presentation that has me thinking. She was talking about poverty and how we as a society, particularly obviously for our group through the lens of healthcare, how we relate to that. But she was shared something that I think fits with this discussion. It's this idea of scarcity. And she was using that as an analogy to say sometimes we think the problem of poverty is too big and we can't solve it. And she had all these statistics that related to ways that people are using money that potentially could go to that cause. So one example that she shared is that last year on Valentine's Day, this year, Americans spent over $400 million on Valentine's Day for their pets. So she had a whole bunch of these just staggering numbers like that. But the point is she brought up this idea. She said when we have this perception of scarcity, we go into this mode of acquiring and hanging on to things. And so I'm thinking about our time and our finances and some of those things. We constantly have this narrative in our society that there's a scarcity, there's a lack. We don't have enough food, we don't have enough time to do all the things we want to do, and so I've got to grab this thing that's going to help me save time, or I don't have enough money to do all the things I want, so I've got to find these financial opportunities and tricks that allow me to hang on to more of my money or get more value from it. What I think popped up to me that's really interesting in that is the converse. The things that we feel like we have in abundance, we don't care about and we don't value. And what's happening in our society right now when it comes to ideas about truth and about what's right and wrong? I kind of walked in at the beginning of a discussion about that in terms of the definition of marriage or different things like that. We have this idea now that there's this whole marketplace of ideas and they're all equal. So there's an abundance of truth. And so as a society then, when I think about people my age and younger, the value that we place on any single instance of one of those ideas is maybe very different. And it's our opportunity to really hone in and say, what is the real value that exists there, and how do we make sure that that's what we're focusing on? And I think going back to the time and resources and our kids, I just want to echo the sentiment that I think sometimes it's not the amount of time, it's the quality of the time. I think about that at the hospital. I think about physicians that have young families, and I think, man, they work these long, long hours, and they're on call, and how can they possibly have good relationships with their kids? And then I think about the times that I bring work home with me, and I let that impact how I'm relating to my kids, and how it takes me out of the moment that they're trying to have with me. I come home with, okay, I've got this short amount of time, this is what I want to have and the experience I want to have with my kids. They have something totally different in mind, and I spend too much time kind of in conflict with them about that instead of making the most of that time and that experience. And I guess the reason that comes up to me is I think about how often do I do the same thing with God, where He's got a plan in mind and an experience that He wants to have with me, and I bring my own agenda, and I'm in conflict with Him about how do we do the exact thing that I want to do. And so it's for me at least, it's challenged me to say, how can I have the relationship with God as a child that allows me to understand and inform the relationship that I want to have with my kids, instead of feeling like I'm modeling that same conflict.
Well, we appreciate your input here, and that the rest of us are grandparents, and you are closer to the real thing. Michael, I'm sorry, Michael. And you don't even have gray hair, so I don't know how I missed that. But
Hardly gray hair in that head.
That's because I recently had a haircut.
Okay. Well, I think I know what I was going to say as there was some ideas went by like that. I tried to grab it. It was something like this, and my children were in middle grade. My oldest one is about grade 10 or 11. And we lived not far from the school. Comfortable place. Up in the hill just north of, up by the water tower. And I was working from home to try to help cover the basis. I most of the time have. And one night we were eating or whatever. I think we were eating supper together, and it was quiet. And my oldest said, do you like how quiet it is here tonight and how much talking we're doing? And yeah. She says, well, go try to use the phone, would you? She had unplugged it. She said, it doesn't matter what happens here. If that phone rings, she says, everything stops and you go answer it. So I fixed that for this hour. Well, what was I supposed to say or do? What do you think, Lauren? What do you think of that move she made?
I think, if you bring that forward about 30 years, what's more important than the text coming in on your cell phone? I mean, people drop everything in the middle of a conversation to read that text. And, I'd blow a kid right away. I mean, what's important to me? Nothing. The text is more important. Or the phone call, whatever. I think it's the quality, like somebody said, it's the quality. He was questioning the quality of timetable. There was interference there.
Seems that that she didn't fully consider the fact that her mother was staying at home. And I was trying to cover all the bases single-handedly and be here. So she didn't get the picture, what that might take. So I just had to stand back and say, well, I have to accept her reality, and there's a lot of truth in it.
You don't think that sounds a little selfish?
Oh, maybe more than a little.
Well, but that's what was important. She felt that there was a lack there.
Right.
You have to meet those needs.
What's important to her is more important than what's important to you, and that is the definition of selfishness.
I want to let someone else take it.
I'm going to go a different direction. This is just a little point that I heard, and it really makes sense. But that neglect in studies has shown as harmful to children as abuse.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, there's different ways of wording that. There's to be proactive and reactive. I have something else I wanted to say, but I can't find it. We'd asked about the idea, is God a risk taker? In a sense, God lost his own wager here on earth.
Temporarily.
His universe rebelled, he lost his angels, he lost his humans, worst of all. His own son was murdered by the very ones he created. Yet for God, it was all worth it for the sake of having a family. That's a commentary, that's not from the Bible. Is there any institution in existence that can possess such opposing realities as that of the family? On one hand, it can provide the apex of security and love. On the other, it can breed the basis for the deepest pain and resentment, mask the most shocking violence, and disfigure the souls of its offspring. Is the family responsible for all that, potentially?
You know, interestingly, something that our society doesn't talk about because it's not politically correct. But, you know, lots of people are happy to tell you how crime, and you have majority of black people in prison. The majority of people in prison are black, and drugs, and how it's race related, and it's because, you know, all the white supremacists are suppressing them. But the truth is, these people that are in prison, regardless of race, people who commit crimes, who do shootings, all of these things, get into drugs, the one thing that they almost all have in common is no father at home. Single mother, grew up in a single mother family.
And yet there's Ben Carson who grew up in a single mother family.
Well, yeah,
There are
it's not
exceptions.
100%,
Yeah.
but it's
It's a common denominator.
It's a common denominator, yeah.
So the white supremacists on one side of the prison and the Crips on the other side have more
Yeah.
in common than they realize.
exactly.
Well, so when we start our own families, we participate in the divine risk of creating relationships. We choose a spouse, initially a total stranger. Choose them in an unknown future to bind our lives forever. And we have children that are bundles of joy. But we soon realize they are also bundles of potentialities in which that initial joy is either extended or terminated in pain and heartbreak.
Absolutely.
And yet, like God himself, we continue to merge our lives with others to create families. Why? Perhaps it's the lyrics of Bob Bennett's song, "You nail a truth worth pondering, that love is the only risk worth taking." Is that a truth? Definitely involved.
I think the truth is that we're designed to have those relationships.
Yeah, we talked about loneliness last week or the week before, the role of being alone. So, When God, whose very essence is love, we could go to text to prove this, but we won't take the time, He fashioned us in His own image. The desire to love and be loved became indelibly etched in our nature. Okay. He beat me to it. Though sin has wreaked such chaos in creation, even it has had difficulty erasing love as the supreme ethic. I can't even read. Though sin has wreaked such chaos in creation, even it had difficulty erasing love as the supreme ethic with humanity. How many people live on this planet can honestly say they prefer a life absence of all love? Not many. Because families are the wellspring of relational love. And they are ubiquitous. You know what that means? They're potentially everywhere. God wanted it to be so. We can read about that in Genesis several times. Familial love can lead us to hear the first whisper of God's love for us. In Steps to Christ, the statement is made, the deepest and tenderest earthly ties that human hearts can know, and through those, God has sought to reveal Himself to us. So, we talked about families being at risk and under attack. Is it any wonder then that the family has become the target for Satan to destroy? It's for this reason that we need the multi-dimensional, familiar pictures of God as a father and husband, many times talked about in the Old Testament, and Jesus as a son, bridegroom, and brother, or New Testament concepts and expressed that way. In fact, any insight into the character of God, who is love, provides the benchmark for us to cultivate love within our own families. So the book of Proverbs is the valiant attempt of one king to hand down an inheritance of divine wisdom to his children. So, may his legacy result in our families reflecting God's dream for a reunited creation, a universal family sustained by His love. And as I was looking here this morning, I saw 31 chapters in Proverbs.
Did you read chapter 31?
No, I haven't read it. Have you?
Yes.
Okay. Should I? I was going someplace else and maybe rather elementary with that. But it's suggesting that if we made one for each day of the month, and we instructed our children to read a chapter a day for their morning worship or for their private devotions, and then we could invite anyone and everyone to share his or her favorite proverb. Whether this may seem elementary, but at least it's a system or an idea that could be implemented. So, it's been suggested in another commentary that I have for you is that perhaps the single most significant lesson in the book of Proverbs is that there is a book of Proverbs. So the implied message to all generations is, parents, talk to your children. So notice when Moses spoke to the children of Israel, he spoke the commandments of God, and he said that these words need to be in our hearts. And while even stopping to dip the quill in a second time, he says these words need to be in our children too. Teach them diligently. Diligently is the way King James translates Hebrew. From which comes other meaning from a root there to repeat. Tell them to your children. Keep on telling them. It's kind of built into the very language. Another root is a meaning to sharpen or to engrave. To teach incisively, as in to drill into them. The meaning to deep. For both repetition and deep engraving of the commandments with regard to teaching children could fit the context. So is there such a thing as being redundant or overdoing it? Or how can you avoid being perceived by your children as overdoing it? More of this, more of that, more of that, more of that.
I think Don made a point earlier that his grandfather lived it.
Lived it.
And it wasn't drilling into the fact that I've got to get this inside of you. It was the reverse of that. He was getting it inside because of the actions, the results.
I think it goes to Michael's, observation from the article or whatever about not having a father, not having a male figure to model the behaviors. And so what we see, and different people learn in different ways. Some people you could say just read a verse every day. Others you might say, hey, let's read together to be able to actually, rather than having to dictate, inviting them to join you and participate with you.
Well,
I think that in response to your question, that humans are rational beings and children aren't necessarily rational, but as they grow up, they will become, hopefully. You don't have to necessarily trick them into being good. You can just tell them and have them memorize stuff, and maybe they don't understand it, and maybe they do, but someday they will, and then they'll still have those memories and those lessons.
But they're gonna model themselves after the father too, and the mother, because they see how you act. And they see what happens when you do things and how you live.
I think Michael's point, it's not one or the other, right? It's both. And it's true, the stuff, it's the hardest time in my life, where I was most discouraged, the thought that came to my mind is the little song, Jesus Loves Me. That was the biggest encouragement in my darkest hour. And if it hadn't been put there from a very early point, I wouldn't have it to hang on to.
Right on.
So a good example I have is, Eve would let the kids watch VeggieTales and listen to silly songs and all that stuff, which is fine. They're funny. But then the kids would be singing these songs all the time, and repeating these stories. And at one point I realized, how come you haven't been making them listen to Bible stories? It's in their brain. They have that stuff memorized, whether they want to or not, because their brains, it just sticks to them. So she has them listen to Bible stories. They want to listen to Bible stories, and they know all these stories. They know what happened with Joseph and all these people in the Bible because she puts Bible stories on when they're writing
And they're good examples. Anyway, I wanted to mention, since we're talking about fathers, because I grew up without a father. And so from personal experience, I can see what I missed because I didn't have a model. They're very important, and I lack that. You can't learn that out of a book.
The Bible promises, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart.
Right.
So it's kind of saying that things stick to kids. And they may have a period of time where it doesn't seem apparent that it's stuck to them. But when they're old.
CJ, why don't you come in here?
Does our Heavenly Father trick us into being good? Does he trick us into making the right choices and doing the right behaviors? I think what Max just said is really important because it says, when your child is old, they will not depart, which means the way that they behave and relate to authority as a child is reflected in the way that they're going to behave and relate toward God as they develop that personal relationship with Him, which I think goes back again to, I'm thinking about, like, how do I have my personal relationship with God in such a way that it manifests and reflects. And that's, I'm ringing the same bell again, but looking at my kids and the relationship that we have and realizing some of the real challenges that you can't know until you're a parent, it's a lens on my relationship with God, because there's times where I have these young people that want all the answers, they have a really clear idea, and they, as a parent, I just want to say, just listen to me, just do the thing I'm saying, walk down these really simple steps steps right now, and the goal is like just around the corner, and it'll all make sense. And then I find myself going, okay, how many times does God do that with each one of us every day? And we make it so difficult, and we drag our feet, and we bang our heads against Him, and we get so frustrated. And that's the part where it's, when the child is old, they will not depart. And so, to go back to the modeling, how do we model that behavior? How can we model that behavior to our kids, help them to understand? When we follow God, there's times where we are following truly blindly, and we're putting that absolute trust in Him. And there's times where you're going to do that with me, and then there's times where our whole family does that with God.
Well, and if your kids are not living like you wish they would, there's tremendous hope in that. That we shouldn't give up, because the promise is when they're old they won't be like something. Now some kids stay faithful all along, and praise God that there are Josephs that live their entire lives faithful, but there's also Davids who didn't live their lives faithful all their lives.
But he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
You know, Tale of Two Grandpas. My dad's dad was 83 when he was baptized this year.
His mom, okay, his dad posted a thing in the house. I guess it's before I really knew them too well. It was in line with what you said earlier. Don's, one of his favorite expressions is, I would rather see a sermon any day than to hear one.
Why does somebody not want to hear a sermon? Are they afraid of learning something that they don't want to learn?
Pastor, why are people scared of sermons?
They don't have
Especially long sermons. But it's always neat to see it lived out in the life rather than just hear it in theory, you know, for sure.
Plus it's cheap.
That's a huge thing that pastors have to think about. It's a scary thought that your congregation is going to learn as much, if not more, by observing your life as by what you tell them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think that, I don't know. I have a really hard time buying that. It just, because.
Do you buy well, you have never had a pastor who messed up then.
Well, I've had pastors that in my opinion would have messed up, but that doesn't change what the Bible says.
Well, I remember there was a pastor near where I was in school at Mountain View Academy. And, you know, we had a number of churches, and the kids all went to different churches. But one of those pastors messed up and left the ministry. And it was so traumatic for some of the teenagers in his congregation that they wanted to be baptized again because they felt like this pastor was a hypocrite, and so that baptism didn't count. Well, that's not true. Their baptism was fine, but it shows you how clued into what's going on people can be and want to see consistency in the life of the person who's giving them spiritual advice. And that goes for parents, that goes for teachers, that goes for pastors.
No matter what you do in your personal life, that does not change the spiritual advice. Just like Jesus said about the Pharisees, do what they say, don't do what they do. Because they're teaching the law, they're just not following it.
I think God uses every method to reach us, and I also think each of us are wired differently.
Yeah.
But I've thought so much about the Last Supper and what could Jesus have said to break down the prejudice and the ideas of the disciples that would have the impact of him girding himself and washing their feet.
Like a servant.
Exactly. So that, I don't know how he could have communicated in words that message and made the impact that physically doing that act had on the disciples and throughout eternity.
He did communicate it in words over and over again throughout his.
But that act was
How effective was it?
How effective suppose any of it, they still didn't buy it even
Yeah.
after that. Not until he died on the cross did they understand.
And that's a good point, because when somebody that we love dies, oftentimes you remember what their last words were. And they become more important after the person is gone. That's what you hold on to. And maybe that's what happened with Jesus and the disciples.
Yes. So how should one go about sharing with children in a meaningful way? First of all, the wise sayings of King Solomon. Secondly, the thrilling stories of Israel. Thirdly, the commands and principles of God's law. If you go back to Deuteronomy, this concept of a repetitive engraving model of teaching, the rest of the verse could likely be telling one how to do just that. Remember what it says? You shall, you shall talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. So sitting and walking and lying down and getting up, this is in a figurative sense, but they're meant to cover all the different positions and the contexts one may be in during the day. So these activities also cover the whole day. So in all the diverse experiences of the entire day, Mom and Dad are simply talking, conversing, musing or thinking out loud, or even singing about God's Word. And the children listen and are changed. The parents don't just talk about God and His Word for their kids, remember. All the words commanded are first to be on your heart. That is in the heart of the parent. The idea that these words are to remain in the mind as frontlets between their eyes reinforces this heart imperative. It is what the parents are thinking about already. But even having them in your mind is not enough, and parents want their children. If parents want their religion and respect for God of that religion to be passed on to their children, then His laws need to be bound as a sign on their hand. Parents' actions, that is, need to showcase what God's laws look like when expressed through human life. Otherwise, all the God talk will be counterproductive. So as a consequence, children will sit back and appropriately be repulsed at the pageant of parental hypocrisy before their eyes. That's a little stiff, a little rash, a little hard to hear. But I'll go back to my youngest daughter again when she was junior there at Sunnyside, the Adventist Academy next door. She was really enjoying herself. She was the church pastor, whatever they call it. Not the church
Chaplain.
School little chaplain in their class. But she was so disillusioned by what was happening at the administrative and other levels in the Sunnyside church at that particular time. She was so disappointed with the adults. And the kids were trying to take sides and so forth. And that's what blew her out of the water. And we can make excuses now, but nevertheless, that was a really big deal for her. It really means something to me. Because I can remember my school-age children on Saturday night say, Dad, let's go get a movie. Let's go get a video. Only a mile and a half down the road to the video store. We want a video. Well, let's do something else. I'd try to say, no, we got to go get a video. So I said, well, I'll go with you. So we went down there and spent some time going, oh, they had this one, that one. Finally, I relented and let them take one home. So we went home and watched it. And dear friends, I can tell you that what I saw happen before my very eyes was years and years of attempted teaching. The rug was jerked out of the concept in 1 hour of watching Hollywood's production and what the values that were expressed therein. And I'll never forget it. because it was painful. That's not to say we can't go back and reteach and try to fix it.
I think that's where your years and years of teaching didn't just go away. It maybe was forgotten for a little while, but that's, when people get older, their brains develop and they can, we have this thing in the front of our brain that's designed specifically as a filter. And as our brain develops and we get older, we should be able to understand, if you tell me a bunch of stuff and I don't like everything you say, that doesn't mean that everything you say is wrong.
Right.
I may not like some of it, and I can pick and choose which parts of it are true. And my experience, speaking of your teenage daughter not liking the faculty or whatever, leaders at the church, I've had people, a girl years ago that was friends with us and in her 20s, and she was telling us how she wouldn't pay tithe because the Seventh-day Adventist Church doesn't use the tithe money the way they're supposed to. So instead, she gives the money to the charity that she thinks is going to use it properly. And I didn't say anything against it because I didn't really know at the time. But then once I started reading my Bible, she can sit there and say all this negative stuff about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but she's wrong. And if she would take time to actually study her Bible, she would see that the Seventh-day Adventist Church uses the tithes and offerings exactly the way the Bible teaches to use them. So somebody making a statement that the church organization or their leader is wrong, they have to go get backup, and
Right.
it comes from the Bible. Otherwise, they're just making stuff up because they don't want to participate.
So in conclusion, I got a little quick life application here. Because the Seventh-day Adventist Church is an information-rich community. We place a premium on general biblical knowledge, on prophecy, and the innumerable counsels of Ellen White. The church, in the spirit of Solomon to his children, is providing in this week's lesson we just started to go through, give insights into how to have the best family possible. Unless one feel overwhelmed with more counsel, we had a lot of scriptures we could have looked at here. While the Bible itself gives clues to communicate godly wisdom as a heritage. It has used passages that relate primarily to children, but the principles are beneficial to all the members of the family, children, whatever. Here's the quotation from Joshua. The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be sure, so you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. So be sure to emphasize this point. I'm asked to do that as we conclude. For singles and parents without children, lest they feel that these lessons really don't apply to them. Well, it's a big subject. I guess, aren't you glad you've had the privilege of parenthood, if you had? Are you glad you can be counted as part of God's family?
It definitely is the most important job that you'll ever have in this world.
So are we grateful that we can be part of the Cedar Creek family?
Amen.
And Father, we're expressing our gratitude to you directly as we conclude our study this morning. We're thanking you for Cedar Creek and his family here, and for the leadership that Pastor Marty has provided for all these years. We're indebted to him.
I've known him since 1968.
So we're asking for your blessing on the rest of today and on the impact of this study in the days to come. In Jesus' name, amen.